what and the why. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about electronic percussion? Basically anything that's not acoustic. You know, when you hit a drum and the drum makes the sound. Electronic, I'm talking about something that has a transducer that takes whatever input you're giving it and turns it into an electronic signal, as we'll talk about. And then you can manipulate and use that electronic signal in several different ways, as we'll see. So why are we checking this stuff out? Well, because more and more today in modern music and pop music, it's kind of necessary to know about this stuff. I mean, you hear about a lot of drummers that are using triggers these days that have, I mean, even complete electronic drum sets. Just kind of, the music today really calls for that. Kind of with the advent of drum machines and all that stuff in the late 70s and early 80s, drummers have been kind of out of a job in some aspects. Some styles of music really call for that drum machine thing, have been built up around drum machines. But there are a lot of musics these days that kind of use those elements but want to have that live drummer, because there's really, as you guys know, there's no real replacement for a live drummer. But knowing these kinds of concepts, knowing the electronic drums, where they come from, what they're used for, kind of the styles, it's really need to know knowledge if you're going to be, say, drumming for the Black Eyed Peas or Shakira or something like that. You have to know how to incorporate those styles, how to play along with loops, how to use samples, how to monitor this stuff and mix it, how to get all that stuff happening. The more understanding you have of that, the better chance you have of having a gig. You know? So yeah, you can use it in the studio, adds to live performance, as we talked about. A lot of drummers are doing that these days. I mean, like everybody you see now, you read modern drummer, and it's like, okay, drums, heads, cymbals, electronics. It's almost always there, unless it's like a traditional jazz player. But even, I saw Jack DeJohnette with Bobby McFerrin and Chick Corea. He was using a rolling hand sonic pad. Sometimes to comedic effect, but it was fun. And also, I'm going to show you guys how you can use some of this stuff as practice tools to really kind of, I mean, your ear can always be kind of off, but this stuff will put you right there. So I mean, you can use it in a myriad of ways to perfect your playing. There are four main components to electronic percussion instrument. There's the surface that you hit, and that's the same as an acoustic drum set, and that's really where the similarities end. Because instead of having a head that vibrates and creates sound, you vibrate a pad, which may or may not create hardly any sound. But that triggers a transducer, either it's a microphone, a pressure sensor, something like that. That converts that pressure that you get, that strike, into an electronic signal. That electronic signal is given to the drum module or the computer inside the drum pad, which interprets that signal. It's got a certain voltage, you know, it's got a certain level coming from a certain place, and so that module takes that signal and turns it into either one of the internal sounds built into the module or a MIDI message, or both. And we'll talk more about MIDI and stuff here in a second, because that's a lot of fun stuff. And then of course there's the output, which gets it from this to a speaker, which turns it back into physical audible sound. So now we're going to talk about the difference between audio and MIDI. Audio, I'm talking about digital audio. That's a digital representation of sound, you know. You mic that, you guys are in this shack all the time with Pro Tools running, you guys have plenty of experience with that. But basically this audio is broken down, this sound wave is broken down into ones and zeros. You put these ones and zeros together, it says, okay, there's a peak here, a trough here, peak there, etc., until you get this whole thing. And so the better quality of digital audio you have, the more ones and zeros and the more space it takes up. That's why it takes like 10 megs for a minute of uncompressed audio, something like that. MIDI, on the other hand, is also ones and zeros, but instead of putting together a waveform, it's just saying, okay, hit this note at this volume. It's not actually a sound, it's just a digital instruction. I like to think of MIDI kind of as a robot musician. Like you're the musician, you sit behind the drums, you're playing it, you're making music, right? You read a chart, a piece of sheet music, you play it down. That's a musician playing drums. MIDI is a robot playing drums. It'll play exactly what you tell it to without any sort of human feel, which is kind of a detriment for MIDI and programming. But it'll do exactly what you tell it in exactly the same way, either by giving it MIDI sheet music, or like these instructions that I was showing up there, or by playing it in, recording it on a sequencer, and kind of having that same result. So MIDI is just kind of like a robot machine that plays the drums for you, in a sense. So let's talk about these MIDI messages that I got. As I said, it's kind of like sheet music for robots. Instead of reading a chart, it's reading a list of instructions, and it'll do it exactly. So you have your note. Whenever you hit something, anybody who's had any kind of experience with a MIDI keyboard knows that each note is different, or played MIDI drums on keyboard, you know, like F sharp is the hi-hats, and bass drum is C, and snare drum is, yeah. You got your toms there, you know, key drums. So that's the same thing here, except instead of hitting a key, I'm hitting a pad, and those notes have been translated onto this pad. So this is hitting, say that's hitting F sharp now. That's hitting whatever it is. All sorts of different sounds. And this is all generated by MIDI in the computer. So the velocity tells you how hard to play it. Some virtual instruments have different velocity levels where you can trigger different samples based on how hard you hit it. You guys all know what samples are, like recorded drum hits. I mean, I could make a sample here, just record me hitting the drum and load it into here if I wanted to, and bam, I have this drum in here. But to make it really realistic, I would record the drum just like that and just use that, because if I hit it just like that, it'll be the same kind of sound as if I hit it like that, just louder probably. So you have to record it at, because it's a different quality of sound no matter what the intensity that you hit it at. So a lot of these virtual instruments, trying to make things more realistic, they'll record things at different velocities and play those back depending on which velocity you hit. So if you hit it really soft, you'll get that sound. If you hit it like that, you'll get that sound. It's a bit more realistic, and also it's more of a challenge in developing virtual instruments, as we'll talk about here in a second. Position is where to play it. MIDI is set at a certain tempo. Everything's kind of relative to a tempo instead of audio, which is based on real time. So, I mean, you stretch out audio, and then you get a lower quality signal because it's taking that sound wave and stretching it out. You've got less ones and zeros filling up more time, less quality sound wave. MIDI, everything's tied to a certain tempo. You have a certain number of ticks for every beat, so depending on what the tempo is, you can have that many instructions in there. So if you slow things down or speed it up, you'll still have the same instructions played back perfectly at whatever tempo you want. So MIDI's pretty easy. So you may get one of these things and then look in the back and be like, what's going on here? There's a bajillion plug-looking things. I don't know what goes where. I don't know how to get sound happening. And it's not that hard, as we'll see in the next 2 minutes. So we got your trigger inputs all across the bottom. That's kind of like, you got your transducer, your pad, your transducer. It's got to get to the module somehow. It's through these inputs. Most electronic drum sets come almost pre-wired these days. So you just gotta set it up. It's already got the wire kind of there. You just plug it in the right one. It can be kind of a mess, but if it's properly labeled, you'll be fine. So you just gotta plug snare into there, or the tom into there, the other tom, etc. It's a lot of plugs. Depends on how many instruments you have. This thing has a couple extra plugs in here. As you can see, it's got foot switch trigger in. Those are if I wanted to hook up an additional controller. an additional pad.
Like a sustain pedal for electric keyboards.
Something like that. Instead of, it would be like you have a 5-octave keyboard and you want an extra octave. Kind of like that. It just gives you more options. So I actually have a bass drum trigger. So you can hook up like another bass drum on here and use that along with this using the computer in here.
You're talking about a control.
Oh, okay. You're hooking up the
one Ron's talking about is like a trigger.
Yeah.
Like another pad.
So can you use like a roll-in straight up electric drum set as a replacement for triggering samples or loops the same way those do?
You can, yeah. So like that's the whole concept behind drum triggers. You ever seen those like acoustic drum triggers? You put them on here, it's got that sensor on them. They're not the best things necessarily, they're not the most reliable, but you can use them for great effect. We've got this Akira Jimbo video I'll show you guys. It's pretty awesome. He does some wild stuff with drum triggers. But I mean, that's what it is. That drum trigger is the transducer. That takes what you're playing here and turns it into an electronic signal. And then that plugs in to the module to be interpreted as audio or MIDI or whatever you want. So all of a sudden you can take this acoustic drum and make it sound like this.
But you would have to be a distance away so the natural sound of the drum would hit.
Yeah. And if you don't want that acoustic sound, you would have to muffle it or be at a certain distance away.
You know, I used to use those Marcus Berry triggers, which are really small, really narrow, and mounted on the rim. So you got your acoustic sound, and you hit the rims, and you got whatever.
I think Akira does that as well.
And then you play rim shots, and you get both. So that's so you don't hear the acoustic sound when you hit the rim. When you hit just the rim, so you sort of get messed up the worlds.
Yeah, and you can use those all together with the same drum module. So a lot of folks will have like some drum triggers and some electronic pads all plugged into the same module so that they're all kind of synced up. And then you've got all these sorts of audio outputs that you can use. So this is this is all outputting that digital audio stuff we talked about earlier. And you can send it from the main outputs up top. You've got right and left stereo outputs. Right up here. And that'll output to your speakers, to whatever you want. To a mixer, however you want to get the audio out of here. You've got phones, so you can plug headphones in, use those for monitoring, which comes in handy, trust me. Individual outputs, not all instruments have that, but if you want like a certain trigger or a certain sample or something to come out, an individual output, that's what you would use there. Yeah.
Question. I've always wondered this with the outputs. How many of them can you use at the same time?
All of them.
All of them? They all work together?
Pretty much, yeah. So the MIDI outputs will only output that MIDI information. USB usually outputs MIDI, sometimes also audio, but usually it's just using MIDI. So I've got this hooked up via USB in my laptop. Audio can all be running at the same time. Phones usually has its own separate volume, which makes it good for monitoring. So you can have like a click track going in here that you're hearing that's not being output out there. And monitoring can be a big issue depending on what you're using and what you're trying to use it for. If you're trying to play along with loops being triggered from here, having that monitoring thing is really essential. Because that's like strict tempo, and if you get off, it's like... And then all the outputs can be used simultaneously as well. If you want to have like the digital out going into a recording system, as well as the main output going into the main speakers, you can have all that happening at the same time.